German forests, and they had a whole sort of green dimension. They also, by the early 20th century, had a friendly sort of gay movement, which was aligned with the German Social Democratic Party. And there was a discourse of votes for women and the suffragettes and so forth. And on the whole, the left parties supported votes for women. They weren't as good about it as they should have been, and they didn't anticipate modern feminism. I don't know, I just think, just my final point would be, I tend to think that when the left has amounted to something, it's actually found an end. I'm depressed at the moment. I mean, Michael was absolutely right, the Michael here on my right. I agree with him. I think movements are sort of fundamental. But it does seem to me that you've got to have an end. And back in the 19th century, it was the 8-hour day. You know, the 8-hour day was a fantastically unifying goal. And if they hadn't had that unifying goal, later on it was, and in Europe it was, having universal suffrage. That was a unifying goal very often for certain social democratic parties. That universal suffrage didn't exist. And so there's a sort of, I suppose, dialectical relationship between having a goal and having a movement. It's very, very difficult to have a movement if you don't have a goal.
Right. Back in the back of the room.
Eric Alterman. I actually mailed in my dissent subscription renewal yesterday, but I missed the pickup, so I went out today.
There's a holiday. May Day is a holiday in this country. We don't pick up mail on May.
I have two quick quibbles with things that were just said, and then actual questions. Quibble number one is Sherry, what you just said about the Obama administration. Sherry, they would agree with you 100%. It's exactly what they tried to do. You have to account for the media, political, environment, cultural system in which they're operating. But they tried to sell health care exactly the way you described that you wish to have. And with regard to Robin, it's a more arguable point, but I would put forth that this health care program is the most progressive health care program that this system would allow. And so if you want a more progressive health care system, and we all do, we need a more progressive country, which is a separate thing. Here's my question. Liberalism has become the name of my desire as well as the name of my politics. It wasn't always that way. The reason it has become that way is in significant measure because of my interactions with quasi-socialist institutions in this country and elsewhere. In other words, there is a real problem that this American attitude that dates back to Thomas Paine, that the government that governs best governs least, points to, which is that there is a problem with human motivation in socialism, and there is a problem with bureaucratic delivery of services in socialism. And that when I was a kid, you could always say, well, the people at sea are terrific. That's what socialism is. But you can't even say that anymore. So my question is, and I know, Michael, you've written about this some, but where in the history of socialist self-critique is there a response to these very real problems with socialism, which is that in many respects they seem inconsistent with human nature in terms of the reward system, and B, they're very, very difficult to deliver efficiently, and capitalism is nothing if not efficient.
Nice small question.
Actually, when I came of the right age and went to the Social Security office in New York, I had a wonderful encounter with the federal bureaucracy. They were enormously helpful. They were absolutely eager to start giving me money, and were quite willing to do whatever was possible within the law to give me as much money as possible. And I walked into that office. There was a big picture of Franklin Roosevelt on the wall, and I thought, here is social democracy in action, and it worked beautifully. So there are certainly some bad examples of bureaucracy. The Immigration Service, which is not a socialist institution, functions very, very badly. When you try to get a driver's license in Pennsylvania or to get your car inspected, you hate the bureaucracy. But those are also not socialist institutions. I think it is possible to train bureaucrats to behave decently if they are working in institutions that they think are valued by the people they are working for. And it's also possible, as Robin argued, to decentralize a lot of the welfare delivery systems. If we can find people to do the work in the decentralized spaces. And that also is something that we can, that lends itself to leftist experimentation.
Can I say one
Yeah.
quick? I'd like to say two things. First of all, I completely disagree with your characterization of the Obama administration's ability to sell that health care proposal. I have a PhD, and I couldn't tell you exactly what it was that was in that health care bill until I read 67 articles in the New York Times about it. It seems to me impossible to argue that they did the best job they could selling that thing.
I didn't say that. I didn't
No,
say
no,
that. You're misinterpreting what I said.
but I also don't think that saying that there's the equivalent of a right-wing media conspiracy is helpful either. I
Why
mean,
did I say that?
Well,
no, okay, fair enough, fair enough. I think that they could have done a better job. I think that given the prejudices out there, being proactive and saying, look, here are the 5 great things that this health care bill is going to do for the average American would have been fabulous. I didn't see that. You may know more about this than I did, but I was watching it and I never saw that. I saw reactive rather than a proactive strategy.
I was speaking specifically to the point you made, which was that the bill was portrayed as a grand government takeover when there was no government takeover.
Exactly.
They did not portray it as a grand government takeover. They tried to portray it as an intervention that would allow people more choice within the private system. It was misportrayed that way, but not by them.
No, but that, and in that we agree. I'm just saying the question is then whose fault it was that the general perception was that it was. I think that's largely their fault, but that's another issue. The second question I think is, or the question that you actually posed at the end, I think is the more important one and the more interesting one. And I think that that is because there is this general perception, and maybe that's because people like ourselves have not done a good job of differentiating different strands within the left. The characterizations you make are perfectly valid, but I do not think they are valid for the left overall. They're certainly not valid for the people who I, perhaps idiosyncratically, consider social democrats as opposed to socialists, who have never been advocates of giant government programs or bureaucratic interventions for the sake of them, just for the sake of themselves. They don't believe in the state just because they like the state. They believe in, and as to use the old adage, as much state as necessary, but no more than that. I think confusing those different parts of the left is the same thing as calling, someone who believes in liberalism some kind of right-wing Hayekian, right? Presumably that's not what you mean by liberalism. There's different strands of liberalism. There's also different strands in the socialist movement. I don't think it's fair to tar the sort of dissent social democratic left with, the people who believe that the state always does the best job. I don't believe that that's part of what the social democratic heritage is at all.
Could I just come
yeah,
in
real
with a
quick,
quick-
because we have a lot of people out there who want to ask questions.
A quick point on response to something Eric said there, and it's the following, that I think you'd be absolutely right that a distinction must be made. It's not a question of blanket, that socialist methods, and programs, don't work, that all of them don't work, all of some. It's much more a question. Some of them are well thought out and do deliver the goods, and I think Social Security is a very good example and is about, it's even centrally organised, but is very efficient and has a lot of public support. And I would say Sherry's account, which was excellent in many ways, of the impasse of the European left, the only thing that you could have perhaps said is that there was a sense in which they didn't work out how to deliver both welfare and full employment. The real problem from 1970 onwards is that unemployment remorselessly increased, and it did so because the taxes that paid for the welfare state were payroll taxes, they were putting up labour costs, and they were reducing demand in the European Union as a whole. I'm sorry, this may sound like a rather technical economic issue, but if you get this technical economic mechanisms wrong, then costs can escalate, and that's actually what happened with welfare. Labour costs, inhibited investment, and unemployment. I'm glad to say that in the current crisis, actually Germany has done much better, and actually unemployment hasn't. They've gradually finding solutions to these problems, and unemployment hasn't jumped in the current crisis. That's a big gain. And